He was already late when the rain started, the kind that soaks through shoes and patience alike. The city looked indifferent, fluorescent and tired, as he pushed open the door of the motel after a double shift that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Every dollar in his wallet had a job waiting for it. Rent, groceries, his son's field trip next week. Nothing extra. Nothing wasted. That was when he heard the argument at the counter. A girl, barely old enough to vote, clutching a frayed backpack like it was proof she belonged somewhere. The clerk's voice was sharp, rehearsed, and final. No ID. No credit card. No exceptions. The word "no" landed again and again, each time stripping something human from the exchange. He didn't plan to stop. Men like him were trained not to. Keep your head down. Don't draw attention. Don't invite trouble. But something about the way she stood there, chin lifted despite the humiliation, felt familiar. It looked like the same strength he practiced every morning in the mirror before waking his son. He stepped forward quietly. No speeches, no performance. Just a question about the nightly rate and a hand sliding his card across the counter before doubt could catch up. The clerk barely looked at him. The system never does. The receipt printed. The key slid over. The transaction was over before it could be questioned. The girl turned, startled. Their eyes met for a second that carried more weight than either of them understood. She said thank you, softly, like the word had learned not to expect an answer. He nodded, already backing away, already telling himself this was not his story to tell. Outside, the rain had slowed, but the cold stayed. He sat in his car for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, wondering if he had just made a mistake he couldn't afford. Then his phone buzzed. A message from his son asking if he was on his way. Reality reclaimed him. He drove home thinking the night would end there, filed away as another small sacrifice no one would ever notice. He did not know the girl was standing at the window of that motel room, watching his taillights disappear, committing the shape of his kindness to memory. He did not know that by morning, the balance of power he had learned to survive under was already shifting, quietly, relentlessly, toward a reckoning no one was prepared for. For most of his life, invisibility had been a survival skill, something passed down without words. At work, at parent-teacher meetings, in rooms where decisions were made by people who never learned his name, he had learned to shrink without disappearing completely. It was safer that way. The world could not punish what it refused to see. Tonight felt no different, just another example of how dignity often costs more than it pays. Yet somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a quiet unease followed him, as if a line had been crossed without permission. He did not know why his chest felt heavy, or why sleep would come in fragments, broken by the image of a motel hallway and a girl standing alone. He told himself tomorrow would reset everything. Morning always did. The alarm would ring. The uniform would go on. He would return to being unnoticed. He believed that with the confidence of a man who had never been allowed to imagine what happens when the unseen are finally remembered. And that assumption was to be challenged in ways beyond belief. Morning always arrived too early for him, not because the clock was cruel, but because responsibility never slept. He woke before dawn to pack a lunch with more love than options. tying his son's shoes while listening to stories about school that deserved more attention than his tired eyes could give. There was no partner to tag in, no safety net, just a promise he made at a graveside to keep going without complaint. Bills lined the kitchen, table like silent judges, rent, utilities, daycare. He paid them with precision, not hope, because hope was a luxury for people with margins. Still, he never missed a parent meeting, never forgot a permission slip, never let his son see the fear that crept in when the numbers didn't quite add up. This was what dignity looked like when nobody was applauding. At work, he became smaller, not because he lacked skill, but because the room had already decided who mattered. His ideas were repeated later by louder voices. His punctuality was expected, not praised. Promotions passed him by with polite smiles and vague explanations about timing, fit, and culture. Words that sounded neutral until you learned how often they landed on the same people. He absorbed the slights without drama. That was his quiet defiance. While others postured and complained, he delivered. While managers talked about values, he practiced them. The building ran because people like him showed up early and stayed late, keeping systems alive that refused to see them as human. If anyone bothered to look, they would have seen leadership. In the way he steadied chaos, integrity in the way he owned mistakes that weren't his, strength in the calm he carried under pressure. But invisibility had rules, and he followed them well. Don't ask for too much. Don't expect fairness. Don't make anyone uncomfortable by reminding them who does the work. Online, strangers told the truth more clearly than executives ever did. Men like him keep the country running. Men like him raise children alone without sympathy. Men like him are praised in speeches and ignored in practice. He never read those comments, but he lived them every day. By the time he stepped into the office that morning, badge clipped and shoulders squared, he expected nothing. He did not know invisibility was about to fail him, publicly, suddenly, and without permission. Before the day was over, the world decided who she was long before she ever spoke. A glance took inventory of her clothes, her posture, the backpack worn thin by movement, and the verdict arrived instantly. Runaway, addict, liability. The labels were efficient, relieving everyone else of curiosity and responsibility. It was easier that way. She learned early that explanations invited interrogation, and interrogation led to systems that fed on vulnerability. Forms without boxes for truth, offices that closed at 5, smiles that hardened when her answers didn't fit. So she watched instead. She listened. She stored details like currency, noting who rushed, who judged, who performed kindness only. When it was safe, she was not reckless. She was deliberate. Every step had been measured, every silence chosen. She spoke clearly when necessary, withheld when it protected her, and never let desperation make her careless. People mistook restraint for emptiness, and that misunderstanding became her camouflage. The motel night was not a collapse. It was a calculation interrupted by something unexpected. The clerk's refusal followed a script she already knew by heart. The man's intervention did not. He didn't ask questions that demanded pain as payment. He didn't explain himself. He simply acted as if dignity were not something to be rationed. Inside the room, she sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet arrive. Shelter was not the miracle. Recognition was. Someone had seen her without trying to own her story. Someone had treated her presence as unremarkable, which in a world addicted to spectacle felt radical. She reviewed the night the way others reviewed balance sheets, assessing risk and outcome. One variable had changed. Not her circumstances, but the proof she needed. Proof that character still surfaced under pressure. Proof that power could be tested without warning. By morning, she would shed the assumptions that clung to her like shadows. The city would see a different version of her, polished and undeniable. And when she walked into that building, she would carry with her the memory of a man who believed she mattered before it mattered to him. She understood how quickly rooms rewrite narratives, how authority sanctifies assumptions, and how silence can be a weapon or a shield. Tomorrow, she would choose visibility on her own terms, not as a plea for mercy, but as a measured act of accountability that the city would remember when consequences finally arrived. Morning did not change the building, only the mood inside it. He walked through the doors with the same badge, the same posture learned from years of staying unnoticed, and the same awareness of where he stood in the hierarchy. The walls were glass and steel, polished to reflect authority, not people like him. Greetings passed over his head. Conversations paused when he approached, then resumed without him. Something was different. It traveled faster than coffee, whispered through cubicles and offices with closed doors. Executives hovered, assistants moved with rehearsed urgency, and managers checked phones they pretended not to care about. A new leader was arriving today. That was all anyone knew, and somehow it was enough to make everyone nervous. No name had been shared. No resume circulated. Just the warning that change was coming from the top, sudden and non-negotiable. The kind of change that didn't ask permission and didn't explain itself afterward. People speculated anyway, filling the silence with fear disguised as confidence. Someone important, someone connected, someone who would know who belonged and who didn't. He took his seat and opened his workstation, pretending not to listen while absorbing everything. He had survived enough reorganizations to know how quickly loyalty became disposable. Careers ended quietly in rooms like this, with polite language and irreversible decisions. Nobody ever warned the ones who kept the place running around him. Voices sharpened, jokes landed harder. Authority flexed in small ways, as if dominance could be rehearsed before it was tested. The system sensed inspection, and like all systems built on exclusion, it tightened its grip. He told himself it was none of his business. Do the work. Keep your head down. Protect your son's future. Yet something in his chest refused to settle. The memory of the night before lingered, unwanted and unresolved, as if the kindness he thought was finished had followed him inside. Then the elevator chimed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Bodies turned. The air changed, charged with anticipation and calculation. Whatever was about to step out carried the power to rewrite rooms like this, to elevate some and erase others. He remained seated, eyes forward, invisible by habit. And that was when the doors began to slide open. In that suspended moment, every unspoken hierarchy held its breath, unaware it was seconds away from being judged and permanently redefined by a truth none of them could outrun. Silence fell before anyone could decide how to react. The elevator doors finished opening, and the room seemed to tilt as recognition rippled through him alone. The girl from the motel stepped forward, But the word girl no longer fit. Her posture was assured, her suit precise, her expression calm. In the way authority never needs to announce itself, she did not rush. She let this space adjust to her presence, let eyes recalibrate and assumptions scramble for cover. Executives straightened, smiles appeared too late, and respect arrived suddenly, desperate to be useful. A name was spoken somewhere behind him, followed by a title that landed like a verdict. This was not a guest. This was command, his breath caught before he could stop it. Memory collided with reality, rain and fluorescent light folding into polished marble and glass. He remembered the backpack, the quiet thank you, the way she had watched him leave. Now she stood at the center of the room that had always looked through him, holding the authority everyone else had borrowed. For a moment, her eyes found his, not accidentally, not vaguely. She saw him with intention, and in that instant, the balance shifted. He felt exposed in a way invisibility had never prepared him for. Whatever this was, it was not coincidence. It was continuity. She said nothing. That silence did the work. It stretched just long enough for guilt to surface, for arrogance to reconsider its posture, for power to realize it was being evaluated. The room waited for her approval the way it had never waited for his. He understood then, with a clarity, that left no room for denial. The man who gave her shelter was now standing before power itself. Not loud power, not cruel power, but something sharper. Power that remembered. Power that measured character before competence not around him, the system. Leaned forward, ready to perform loyalty. Around her, control settled naturally, unforced. And between them hung a story no one else knew yet, a quiet exchange that would soon demand accounting. She finally turned toward the head of the table, preparing to speak, preparing to begin. He remained still, heart steady but altered, knowing whatever came next would test more than policies or profits. It would test the truth of who people were when consequences arrived, and whether kindness could survive contact with authority without warning or mercy. She let them speak first. That choice unsettled people who were used to filling silence with certainty. Introductions followed, polished and self-congratulatory, achievements recited like armor. Compliments arrived wrapped in surprise, the kind that praised her composure, as if it were unexpected. Questions drifted toward tone and fit, not substance, each one carrying a small test of belonging. She listened without interruption. Notes were taken. Names were remembered. When a comment slid toward condescension, she met it with patience that refused to soften the point. Arrogance revealed itself in smiles that lingered too long, in explanations offered before she asked, in confidence borrowed from rooms that had always nodded back. Across the table, he watched. He recognized the pattern because it had shaped his days. Loud entitlement mistook volume for truth. Quiet integrity waited, worked, and endured. He wondered if the night before lived anywhere beyond his own memory, or if it had already been filed away as a convenient myth. He did not seek recognition. He only feared erasure. A senior voice joked about grit, about earning respect the hard way, about people who start at the bottom and stay grateful. Laughter followed on cue. She did not laugh. She looked at the speaker with the same focus she had used in the motel hallway, weighing intent against impact. The room mistook her silence for permission. It leaned further, Advice was offered she did not request. Warnings were framed as mentorship. Lines were crossed with professional language and practiced charm. She let it happen, collecting evidence without spectacle. Then she spoke. Not to correct a number or assert authority, but to redirect the conversation entirely. Her voice was calm, unhurried, impossible to interrupt. The shift was immediate. Attention locked in. Pens paused. She asked a single question, unexpected and disarming. One that had nothing to do with margins and everything to do with character. As it hung in the air, he felt the floor tilt again, understanding that memory had entered the room, and it was about to demand answers no one had prepared to give. No one moved. The people who dominated meetings searched their notes for safety, finding none. He held his breath, realizing this was not about exposure but accountability, and that the next response would reveal who believed power was earned and who believed it was owed. The room waited, tense, listening for truth alone. She didn't raise her voice or soften it. She simply asked what the company rewarded when no one was watching. Not performance reviews, not metrics polished for quarterly calls, but character. Who stepped in when rules said look away. Who acted without credit, without witnesses, without leverage. The question unsettled the room because it refused to be. Managed, numbers could be defended. Strategies could be debated. Character demanded memory. Executives shifted, offering anecdotes that sounded prepared, examples that highlighted themselves. The system tried to reframe the moment back into something measurable, something safe. She let the answers pile up, nodding without affirmation. The discomfort grew visible. This was not the language of power they were fluent in. This was the language of consequence. She asked again, slower this time, who helped others when it cost them something. Silence followed, heavy and uncooperative. Across departments, whispers began. Assistants typed faster. Messages moved between screens, fragments of the exchange traveling ahead of official explanation. People sensed a shift and wanted proof they had been on the right side of it. Morality, once abstract, was becoming a performance metric. He sat still, pulse steady but loud in his ears. He knew the answer, not because he thought himself exceptional, but because he had lived it without expecting reward. The idea that such moments mattered felt almost dangerous. Hope often does. Inside the company, stories rewrote themselves in real time. Past kindnesses were suddenly remembered, past cruelties quietly deleted. People imagined how this meeting would be described later, who would be praised, who would be forgotten. Phones buzzed with speculation, alliances recalculated mid-sentence. The building felt smaller, like walls were listening. Everyone understood something irreversible was happening, even if they pretended not to. Careers hung, breath held, as certainty drained from confident faces across the table, waiting for judgment to finally arrive without appeal. She scanned the room, eyes deliberate, landing briefly on faces that avoided her gaze. Then she looked. At him, the silence sharpened. No one noticed him until that second, until power acknowledged what hierarchy had ignored. When she spoke his name, it landed with the force of recognition. Heads turned. Screens paused. The room recalibrated around a truth it had overlooked. In that moment, invisibility broke, and whatever came next would expose not just one man, but an entire system forced to confront what it had chosen not to see. She didn't begin with names or titles. She began with a night the city forgot, describing rain, a counter, and the way vulnerability is processed like paperwork. She explained that she had once stepped outside her own protection, not as a stunt, but as a test. She wanted to know how systems behave when no one thinks power is present. She spoke about being refused, redirected, reduced to a problem to be managed, about how dignity disappears when it requires effort. The room listened differently now, leaning into details they had trained themselves to ignore. She described the calculations people make when deciding whether someone is worth the inconvenience. She paused, steadying herself, and admitted that most failed the test. Doors closed politely. Rules hardened. Eyes slid away. She did not dramatize it. She didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight, pressing against the polished table and the faces around it. Then she described the interruption. A man who did not ask for context or credentials. A man who did not narrate his goodness. He simply acted, quietly, as if decency were not exceptional. She said that moment stayed with her because it revealed something rare. Not generosity, but respect. Her voice tightened when she explained what that respect meant. Being seen without being studied. Being helped without being owed. In that small exchange, she learned more about leadership than years of training had taught her. The room felt it, the shift from theory to flesh and consequence. Tears surfaced where professionalism usually lived. Not hers alone. Recognition moved through the space, uncomfortable and undeniable. Some people looked down. Others stared at her as if hoping clarity could absolve them retroactively. She finally turned toward him, eyes reflecting gratitude and resolve. She said he reminded her why power should listen before it speaks. Why systems must be judged by how they treat the least protected, not the most impressive. Silence followed, reverent and exposed. The story had done its work, stripping excuses to the bone. And just when it seemed the lesson had settled, she drew a breath, signaling that the reckoning was not complete and that what came next would demand more than understanding. She held the pause deliberately, letting discomfort teach what policy never could. Around her, authority felt suddenly fragile, dependent on choices long dismissed as small. The air carried a shared awareness that neutrality had expired. Whatever followed would separate memory from excuse, courage from compliance, and reveal whether this room would rise to the truth it had just been given. No one spoke, because everyone understood the next decision would echo far beyond titles, departments, and carefully guarded reputations for years to come. She said his name again, this time without pause, and invited him to stand. The room hesitated before following her lead, chairs scraping as attention finally aligned with merit. She spoke plainly about his record, not inflated achievements, but consistency, reliability, and the quiet decisions that never make slides. She named dignity as a qualification, and the word changed temperature in the room. She announced changes with the calm of inevitability. A role expanded, authority clarified, compensation corrected. It was not framed as charity, but as accuracy. Applause tried to start and failed, unsure whether celebration was appropriate when truth felt accusatory. She didn't wait for approval. Respect, she implied, is not a vote. Faces tightened where entitlement had lived comfortably. The old hierarchy shifted, exposing habits it once hid behind procedure. She addressed those habits directly, describing how power mistakes loudness for leadership and confidence for character. She spoke about how systems reward those who take credit and punish those who carry weight without complaint. Each sentence removed another layer of camouflage. He stood there, hands steady, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not triumph, alignment. For the first time, the work matched the worth. Triumph, alignment, for worth. He met her gaze briefly, gratitude exchanged without spectacle. The recognition felt complete because it was public and precise. Around them, people recalculated. Some nodded, relieved to see values named. Others bristled, recognizing themselves in the mirror she held up. The collapse was not dramatic, but structural, like rot exposed to light. Titles lost their insulation. Performance alone no longer protected behavior. She concluded by defining leadership as accountability practiced before it is required. She said leadership looks like choosing people over optics, courage over comfort, and memory over convenience. The sentence traveled fast, already forming captions in waiting phones, already echoing in offices beyond the room. He sat down changed, aware that this moment would reach his son long before it reached headlines. Yet even as the room absorbed the reset, she paused, eyes thoughtful, as if weighing one more decision. The shift was not finished. The most important test, she signaled without words, was still ahead, and it would determine whether this transformation would endure beyond applause or dissolve the moment power felt safe again. She allowed the silence to work, trusting consequences more than speeches. In that quiet, commitments formed, fragile but real. Policies would follow, but example had already moved faster. He understood that dignity, once restored, demands protection. The room sensed it too, a contract written without signatures, binding leaders to the standard they had just witnessed. Nothing here would return to before. Accountability had learned their names, and it planned to stay long after today ended officially. Home smelled like dinner warming and laundry soap, familiar comforts that usually met him with relief. Tonight they met him with something else. He moved slower, not from exhaustion, but from awareness, as if the day had taught his body a new posture. His son looked up from the table and noticed it immediately. They talked about homework and spelling words, about a classmate who shared a pencil. Ordinary things. Yet the boy kept watching, eyes curious, sensing a shift he didn't have language for. When his father laughed, it sounded fuller. When he set his bag down, his shoulders stayed back. Pride had followed him home, quiet but unmistakable. After dishes, they sat together, the boy leaning against him the way children do when safety is assumed. The father didn't mention titles or meetings. He spoke about choices, about doing right even when it costs, especially when no one is counting. He said some days the world doesn't notice, and some days it finally does, but the work is the same either way. The boy nodded, absorbing more than words. He had watched his father leave early and return late for years, never complaining, never asking to be seen. Tonight he saw recognition reflected not in money or praise, but in calm. It made the future feel possible. Before bed, the boy asked a simple question about why people are mean. The father answered carefully, explaining that fear often disguises itself as power, and kindness is how you tell the difference. He tucked him in with the certainty of a promise kept. Alone in the quiet, he felt gratitude settle alongside resolve. Being seen was not an ending, it was a responsibility. Tomorrow would bring conversations, expectations, and eyes that had never looked his way before. He welcomed them without hunger. Outside their apartment, messages moved faster than truth. Reactions building, a story taking shape beyond their walls. He didn't know it yet, but the ripple had begun, and it would reach further than his workplace, carrying a lesson his son had already learned. That integrity outlives obscurity, and hope grows strongest when it is finally allowed to be visible. By morning, attention would follow him into streets and screens, strangers interpreting his story for their own needs. He would remain grounded, focused on bedtime routines and lunches, unaware that validation was spreading outward, and that the quiet example inside his home was becoming a public measure everywhere now. By the next day, the story had escaped the building. Screens filled with fragments, reactions layering over facts, strangers arguing about meaning before they understood it. Some called it overdue, others called it staged. Many simply said they felt seen. The ripple moved faster than intention. Turning one private decision into a public mirror, people shared their own moments of invisibility, the times they were judged by appearance, accent, or silence. They named the exhaustion of carrying worth without recognition and the relief of watching it finally acknowledged. The narrative refused to stay small. It reached break rooms, classrooms, and timelines, forcing a question no algorithm could soften. What do we reward, really? He watched none of it. He packed lunches, walked his son to school, and returned calls with the same steadiness he always had. The difference was not attention, but alignment. Power had passed through his life without erasing him, and that alone felt revolutionary. Commentators tried to reduce the moment to symbolism. Others argued policy. But the truth endured because it was simple. Kindness had not been loud. It had been precise. It had cost something. And it had changed the direction of more than one life. Across the city, leaders repeated the phrase they had heard, measuring themselves against it. This is what leadership looks like. Some meant it, some borrowed it. The words traveled anyway. Doing work their speakers could not control. The girl returned to her role without spectacle, understanding that real authority does not linger for applause. The father returned to his routines, carrying dignity like a standard he would not lower. Between them, a precedent had been set. Quiet and unyielding. It reminded people that progress is not announced by institutions, but practiced by individuals, often quietly, often at personal cost. For many watching, the moment validated identities, long dismissed, affirming that dignity is not conditional on approval. It challenged the habit of mistaking compliance for peace and urged courage rooted in care. The story did not promise perfection, only direction, inviting viewers to choose humanity when systems hesitate. That invitation lingered, practical and demanding, asking what each person would do when kindness offers no audience and justice arrives without warning. Across generations, it reframed success as service, urging communities to protect the vulnerable, celebrate restraint, and remember. That recognition follows values, not the other way around, always together.